Hello and welcome everybody to the third and final event in the Justice Collaboratory's Fall 2021 Policing Conversation Series. This series examines some of the most significant structural barriers to policing reform, and today's event explores civilian oversight of law enforcement and the current state of police accountability in the US. Today, our panelists comprise an embarrassment of riches across the world of police accountability. We have Gabe Davis, the Executive Director of the Cincinnati Civilian Complaint Authority. Previously, Gabe was with the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and worked as a prosecutor at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. We also have Regina Jackson, the chair of the Oakland, California Police Commission and the current president and CEO of the East Oakland Youth Development Center. We have Sergio Perez, Executive Director of the Orange County, California Office of Independent Review. Sergio's resume is extensive and could probably fill the entire hour, but among the choicest mentions on it are that he served as a constitutional policing advisor for the LA County Inspector General's office, as a Deputy Attorney General at the California Department of Justice, as the Director of Enforcement for the Los Angeles City Ethics Commission, and also as a federal rights attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice. And finally, we have Gianina Irlando, the president of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement and current principal at Irlando Consulting, where she advises clients on ways to improve independent civilian oversight and community engagement. Previously, Gia served as Community Relations Ombudsman for the Office of the Independent Monitor in Denver, Colorado. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll begin the conversation with introductory questions for the panelists about their own experiences, followed by more probing questions on civilian oversight and police accountability. Please note that audience members are invited to submit questions of their own using the Q&A and chat functions in your Zoom window. Submitted questions will be reviewed by me and may be directed to the panelists throughout the conversation. So without further ado, let's begin. Our first question is going to go to Gabe. Gabe, can you describe the work of the Civilian Complaint Authority, and can you discuss the history of how the authority originated?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today. And this is a real treat for me and for folks who do this work. And I'm very honored to be joined by such distinguished panelists. So I'm the director of the Citizen Complaint Authority for Cincinnati, and we've been around for about 20 years now. And I'll just start with some of the history and then describe what we do and sort of our mandate. But we are an outgrowth of Cincinnati's collaborative agreement, which came about in 2002 in response to the shooting of an unarmed Black man named Timothy Thomas in Cincinnati. That was sort of the tip of the iceberg for folks around here at that time in the early 2000s. Leading up to that period, a number of other unarmed Black men have been shot and killed by police officers. And so when Timothy Thomas was killed, this sort of touched off a period of unrest here in the city, which led to the Department of Justice coming in and doing investigations. I should say there also was a separate civil rights lawsuit that had been filed weeks before that shooting by the ACLU along with local civil rights organizations. And so that lawsuit combined with the unrest from the shooting and led really to DOJ coming in and negotiating with the city. The city ultimately entered into two agreements, one of which was the collaborative agreement between the city, the police department, the police union, and the local civil rights groups. Another agreement was the memorandum of agreement between DOJ and the city. And both these things together set up CCA, which is my group here, and essentially gave birth to our existence. And we were codified in the city's administrative code back in 2002. And since then, we have done the work of civilian oversight in Cincinnati. And our model is an investigative model. So what that means is we have a team of investigators, which I lead as director. And we investigate complaints against police officers made by citizens in our community. And our jurisdiction is limited to Cincinnati police, so we do not investigate the local, sheriffs, sheriff's deputies or other jurisdictions. But we do investigate complaints made against Cincinnati police officers by anyone who has a complaint to make. And there are a couple of things that we investigate. So there are some things we don't investigate in terms of the allegations. But our core allegations that we do investigate are things like excessive force, improper or unlawful searches and seizures, unlawful stops, pointing of firearms, And we also investigate police shootings, and we do that even if there is no citizen complaint. A good example was we had a police shooting on Thanksgiving a couple of days ago, and so we had to go out that afternoon and start to investigate that case. And we do that for every police shooting that occurs in Cincinnati by a police officer here, as well as any cases involving deaths in police custody. And we have about 5 investigators currently that do that work. So I could say a lot more about it, but I'll leave some time, obviously, for follow-up questions.
Great, thank you, Gabe. Regina, can you describe what the Oakland Police Commission does and specifically how it conducts its work?
Absolutely. What I'd like to say is that the Police Commission is responsible for overseeing the Oakland Police Department and the Community Police Review Agency. Gabe just talked about his work in Cincinnati, so his work is the CPRA for us. And generally, the commission is supposed to ensure that policies, practices, and customs, as well as investigations, conform to the national standards of constitutional policing. This is a volunteer commission of a total of 9, 7 commissioners and 2 alternates. And with over 150 policies that are between 15 and 20 years old, we have our work cut out for us.
Thank you. Sergio, can you talk about the Office of Independent Review? It's uniquely situated kind of in terms of the scope of its mandate. Can you describe that mandate and also discuss the process of how your office performs its oversight function?
Definitely, and thank you again for inviting me to participate in this. And it's a great honor to be on this panel and to discuss this sort of interesting and hot topic. The Office of Independent Review in Orange County came to be after a savage beating of an individual who was incarcerated in a county jail here in the early 2000s and has existed in different forms with different jurisdictions since then. Its current jurisdiction extends to what I like to call the 5 justice-related county agencies here in Orange County. And that includes the County Sheriff's Department, who carries out patrol functions throughout the county and also runs the county jails. The Probation Department, which includes not only field operations, but juvenile detention facilities in the county. The District Attorney's Office. I believe this is the only oversight agency in the United States that has formal jurisdiction over a prosecuting attorney-led agency. The Public Defender's Office. And finally, the Social Services Agency, which makes decisions about when to remove children from the care of their parents or other custodians, and also makes eligibility decisions with regards to certain state and local benefits. The office is a bit of a mixed model. It has the authority and power to investigate individual complaints filed with it by residents of Orange County or those who have been affected by the agencies that it helps oversee. But its focus is on systems. It isn't empowered to inform or carry out the discipline against individual, let's say, deputies at the Sheriff's Department or probation officers. Instead, it's empowered to investigate complaints or other issues and then issue public reports with recommendations. Those recommendations can have no real limits by law. By that, I mean it can recommend changes to policies. It can make recommendations with regards to practices. And it carries out this work through not only fact-finding, but through consistent engagement with members of the community and those that are currently incarcerated in either county jails or juvenile facilities. Our most recent report is a good example of the kind of work that my office creates. It was a report issued in August of this year, detailing an assessment of the use of force policies and practices of the Sheriff's Department. To carry that assessment out, my staff not only reviewed the policies that govern the use of force by the Sheriff's Department, but actually attended live training being provided to new recruits of the Sheriff's Department and into current deputies. And those were trained, we were embedded, so to speak, as monitors in those sessions. Finally, we reviewed a statistically significant sample of use of force incidents to ensure that we had the whole ecosystem in our crosshairs, so to speak, so that our recommendations reflected not only paper policies, but the reality of the situation out there. We also conducted interviews of currently incarcerated individuals and members of the community. The report made several recommendations, and that's one sort of marker of this model, in which reflects both the legal and political realities of oversight with regards to a law enforcement agency that is led by an elected official. We have zero power to mandate change. We have zero power to require particular disciplinary outcomes. Our role is to, as I like to see it, is to understand what is happening, make recommendations, and help the public understand not only what is happening, but those recommendations themselves. So it's a reporting agency at its core.
Great, thank you, Sergio. And Gia, can you please talk about NACOL's mission and what kinds of reforms it seeks to promote?
Absolutely. So NACOL is the only national organization that supports civilian oversight practitioners across the country. We actually do training, we do research, we do a lot of member support, and we've recently picked up a lot of technical assistance since May of 2020. Several new oversight agencies have actually come on board and needed technical assistance. So basically, NACOL is 27 years old and was, I think, really created out of the International Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement when they kind of went defunct. And in that time, we've really grown to over 260 different members, and that includes organizational members that, have hundreds of members within their offices. So, we actually estimate that the number of people that are part of our organization is well over 1,500, probably closer to 2,000. We hold webinars 3 to 4 times. We do academic symposiums. We actually did a huge research grant from the DOJ. It was actually through the COPS office on effective practices. And we don't like to say best practice or national standards, because every single, as you can tell on this call, every single oversight agency actually has a little bit different of a twist on what they do and their authority and everything that they are actually mandated to do. So we actually call it effective practice. I really encourage everybody to look at the NACOL.org website and take a look at those. We did 9 case studies on top of that, and there's actually a really interesting tool on our website that's called the Civilian Oversight Agency Directory, and it's an interactive map that talks about what each of the agencies that have participated in the survey and given us their information actually do across the country. And with that, I actually just want to say that I have really in-depth knowledge of what actually Denver's mandates are. I worked there for almost 7 years, and really just got into the tweaks and everything that had to happen legislatively over 4 different legislative changes to make Denver actually a good model to talk about. So happy to talk about that model. It's a hybrid. It's an investigative model, but it also is based on reviews and recommendations. So I'll leave it at that, and we can get into the meat of stuff. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Gia. We have some follow-up questions that I'd like to pose as part of our introduction to a lot of these models. We'll start with Regina. Regina, can you talk a little bit about the origins of the Police Commission in Oakland?
Yes, thank you very much, Jorge. We had a police corruption scandal about 19 years ago. It was the Riders case. And we became under federal oversight at that time. And we are still under federal oversight with the negotiated settlement agreement having lasted 19 years. We are absolutely in hopes that we are getting to the end of that. However, what that brought to bear was about 52 recommendations that came up that the police are continuing to try and resolve. As a community organizing entity, the citizens back in 2015, coordinated and put together what was called Measure LL, and it was on the 2016 ballot. And that, in fact, created the Oakland Police Commission. We have extraordinary thanks to the Coalition for Police Accountability, who is still kind of the loud whisperer in terms of things that they want to see and concerns that they have around transformation of the Oakland Police Department. I will say that we are considered to be one of the strongest models for commission. We, in fact, do have the power to terminate the police chief, and we did that several years ago. We have to recruit the next police chief. We have just completed a search for the very new inspector general who will be installed soon. And as a part of our work, it's not just policing, it's protocols. We recommend training approaches, and Measure LL didn't quite go far enough, so we had to put another ballot measure on last year, which got similar response, about 82% support, and that was S1. And what it did was clarify some components of Measure LL to allow us to have independent counsel. It's hard to run a commission and then have council be commingled with city efforts. So there are some other pieces to it, but I think I will leave it there. We are very appreciative to the citizens who help guide our information so that we can deliberate and make the best decisions possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. Sergio, for you, can you talk a little bit more about who you make recommendations to when your office comes up with a report that contains recommendations?
Definitely. I can tell you that our intended audience is the community, the members of the Board of Supervisors who have delegated their authority to the Office of Independent Review and to the department at issue, right? Going back to the August report that we issued related to the Sheriff's Department. That was a public report that was made available on our website in an effort to ensure that the members of the community and other interested stakeholders understood its value, its import. I conducted extensive outreach, both media and community-based. And the focus is really on ensuring that the benefits that are created by having full-time professional staff carrying out this oversight work are paid forward, so to speak, to members of the community or other interested parties who don't have the time, the patience to wade through all the information that crosses across the radar of the Office of Independent Review. Because I especially see oversight work that relates to to agencies led by elected officials as one of democracy building, right? We're dealing with such complicated, often obscure, often hidden, but very important practices by government officials, which is what law enforcement is. An oversight agency like the Office of Independent Review can create a tremendous benefit just by translating what is actually taking place and how work is being carried out, whether it's force, other hot topic issues. And so the recommendations are geared towards that, which means that they are, this is at least what we attempt. We attempt to write them simply in a direct fashion that is persuasive so that the Sheriff's Department or whatever agency is at issue can see reason behind the recommendations and can see sort of a path forward and can be interested in taking that path. And so that members of the community will learn from them and the information that has been marshaled to support them.
Thank you. And this next follow-up question, I think, applies to Sergio, Gabe, and to Regina, although I think the answer for all three will be the same. So I'll venture an answer, but to the extent that my answer differs from your reality, please chime in. There's a question about source of funding for your offices. And Sergio, Gabe, and Regina, you all sit on public bodies. And Gabe, you yourself mentioned that the CCA's existence has been codified in the local administrative code in Cincinnati. I imagine similar to other public entities there as well. So that should all indicate that you all are funded through municipal public funds or perhaps county funds from local and county government. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
That's correct.
Thank you. And finally, Gabe, there's a question with respect to kind of the investigative model that you discussed before in terms of that being the model that the CCA follows. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that, specifically kind of the extent to which that model does or does not permit you to kind of not just recommend change, but also see the implementation of change, or at least kind of advise those who have that authority on how to kind of achieve that change?
Sure, that's a very important question. So our investigations start with our staff, but they don't end there. And what we do is we collect information, we do an analysis to determine whether or not the complaint or the allegation is one that's well-founded and whether or not the police conduct violated policy, training, or procedure. And then we write up a report that contains our finding, and we have a set of findings that we make pertaining to the case, whether the allegation is sustained, exonerated, unfounded, or not sustained, or sort of those four technical findings. And so those go into our investigation reports and go onto our board. The 7-member citizen boards appointed by the mayor, and they make an assessment as to whether or not they agree or disagree with our findings and whether or not they think we did a complete job and a thorough job in our investigation. And then once they take that vote, if they agree with us, that goes on to the city manager. The city manager has a determination to make as to whether or not at this point she agrees with us or disagrees with our determination on that case. So our findings are not binding. And as Sergio mentioned, we don't have the ability to impose discipline or to impose corrective action. We can't mandate anything. We provide information as a consequence of our investigations and what we learn. We also can provide recommendations as well. And the administrative code allows for us to do that. It's pretty expressly put there in the code that when we investigate a case, we can issue findings and recommendations as it pertains to that case. And so we've tried to be quite active, I think, in the last 5 years under my predecessor and under my leadership here at seizing that and really trying to make thoughtful recommendations that I think similar to what Sergio mentioned are persuasive, that are concise, but that provide a roadmap for how the implementation steps we'd like to see take place can be implemented in a way that's consistent with some of these effective practices that were discussed by Gia. And so we have that tool in our toolkit. We use it, and then our board has to also review those recommendations as well. And then those go on to the city manager at the end of the day, and then she makes a determination as to whether or not she agrees or disagrees with those. But again, those are not binding in any way. They really are persuasive but informational tools for the community and for the police department. And I should say with the recommendations, we do them in two different ways. We make recommendations as it pertains to corrective or disciplinary action. And so we can recommend that an officer be retrained or be reprimanded or something of that sort. We can also recommend policy changes as well, and procedural changes or training changes. And so we do both of those things as is appropriate.
Great, thank you. We're getting a lot of follow-up questions kind of going into the kind of greater detail about the operations and budget and financing of the organization, but I'm cognizant of the time that we have, so apologies to the audience members whose questions may not be answered in the time limit that we have. I want to shift gears and start really probing more deeply into the subject matter that we're tackling today, specifically civilian oversight, accountability, and what that means and how to achieve it. I'll direct my next question to Gia. Gia, can you help us kind of define our terms when we're talking about civilian oversight, when we're talking about accountability? What do we mean?
Well, so actually everybody's kind of touched on all of these areas, right? So there's actual investigative powers, meaning that you can actually get into every case and really tear it apart, get to all of the evidence, and most agencies then can make recommendations on what happens next in some, on some level. But when you actually have the ability to suggest policy or to recommend policy, you're getting at a little bit more of a proactive way of dealing with problems within any given department, because you're looking for, you know, trends and patterns that are problematic over many cases instead of one case. And then I would argue that that there's a whole nother piece of all of that, and that's the communications piece that's been brought up already. It's the communications and community piece of understanding what needs to happen, where there are where there's insufficient authority in any given organization, and you know how you actually let the community in to help with that piece, right? Make sure that they understand your constrictions, and also make sure that they understand that, you know, no matter how bad a case looks, if it's within policy, it's within policy, right? And that's one of the things I think you're trying to get at with this seminar is, you know, really, does it always seem like we have teeth and authority to do what we're supposed to do? And you really have to have, you know, legs into the community and into policy people to bring it all together for an effective organization. Is that more or less answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And it leads kind of into a follow-up that, again, I'll direct at you, but I'll open up to others to the extent that they may have views as well. When we're talking about, you know, civilian oversight, where, you know, it has that word civilian, right? It's indicative of there being, you know, someone outside of the policing world to whom, you know, the power to oversee is entrusted. And certainly when we're talking about accountability, we're talking about accountability by someone to someone else, or by something to someone else. Who presume, you know, and we can speak generally about this and say, well, it's the public, you know, who oversees, or it's the public to whom, you know, police departments or other agencies are accountable. But what do we mean by that? Who is this public that we're talking about?
I think it's impacted communities first and foremost, people that have been over policed for, you know, generations, and that you know, have never really participated in the public safety sphere because of their fear of law enforcement and the trauma that law enforcement has brought to either them individually or as to their communities as a whole. So when you talk about accountability, you're really talking about being able to trust a public organization that's funded by people's taxpayer money, and that people want to be held accountable for their actions. You know, we don't give every city manager a badge and a gun and say, go do your job, right? We're talking about people that have powers above and beyond other people within government. And we're talking about accountability for the people that actually are out there, you know, as difficult as their job is, that are out there with badges and guns, being able to take people's liberty and also their life. And so when you talk about accountability, you're talking about accountability to the people that are being policed.
To bounce off of Gia's sort of great foundation, I think that one of the interesting struggles in oversight today is increasing the responsibility and responsiveness of oversight structures that exist today, making them accessible to members of the community, and ensuring that their voices are reflected in the work that is being conducted. Law enforcement is almost as specialized as you can get in a government agency. And because of that, it requires a sort of a clear and consistent communication strategy, so that it isn't just the result of an unfortunate and tragic event that then leads to engagement with members of the community. Unfortunately, because of the various laws and different restrictions that exist on both access to and distribution of information, that can be fairly complex. And oversight agencies can suddenly be seen as part of the blue line of silence that often exists when it comes to oversight. It's very unsatisfying to members of the public when they hear, well, you know, there are state laws that prohibit the disclosure of certain information, both in the disciplinary space and beyond it. And continuing to educate members of the community on those restrictions, and to include education on how potential changes might be sought in that arena, right? Is it a state law? Is it a county issue? Is it a city issue? Serving as a informative partner in helping the community understand where change can be sought, if that is what a particular stakeholder group or others seek, I think is a really important part of the mandate on oversight agencies.
Thank you. Regina, I see you have your hand up. Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really important comments. One of the things that Oakland, and I don't think we're alone in this circumstance, is that given the fact that so many of our policies are so wildly out of date, we are trying to find alignment with what the policy allows for and what community expectation is. And of course, because they are out of date, the expectation is far greater. The other thing about it is that, you know, with commissioner positions, we all have full-time jobs. And this is another full-time job. I mean, maybe that plus. And so trying to be responsive to community in the space of our commission meetings, even when our meetings may go on for 5 or 6 hours, is not enough. So we operate in many instances with ad hoc groups, and there have been a variety of different ways to access in order to facilitate transparency. We're doing some, you know, kind of one way so that people can listen to the meeting if they're not in the meeting. And then we're doing forums so that they can give live feedback of their experiences and their recommendations. We're posting policies so that people can see the changes as we're, you know, in real time making them. But I'm telling you, COVID has just really spiraled. You would think that there would be more access, but there's less because there's just such distance age as opposed to when we were in person.
Thank you. That actually meshes nicely with kind of a follow-up with that I have with respect to how your offices, how your bodies, how your agencies interact with the public, right? And how the expectation that the public may have in terms of what you can do for them or what your role is in the process versus the reality of what it is. I'll start with Gabe. Gabe, you know, I imagine, for example, to the extent that your office conducts investigations into allegations of police misconduct, that you may get people come to you who think, okay, so maybe you're my lawyer, right? Like I have a complaint and now perhaps you represent me on an individual basis. You know, how do you respond to folks when they come to you with kind of a misunderstanding or an incomplete understanding of your office and the role that it plays?
Yeah, that can be a real challenge. You're absolutely right. People do have different expectations of what we can do for them and what our role is and who we are. And we have to often remind them as early as the intake stage that this is an investigation process, that there's a level of neutrality and unbiased conduct that we have to abide by that's really enshrined and coded in the law. And we're not here to advocate for your position. We're here to really get to the heart of what happened in this instance and then air those facts out. And we have to also stress that message again at the board meetings when people come and they hear the outcomes. So sometimes the outcomes aren't what they like. If we have to tell them that, you know, we understand that the body camera looks really bad here and that what happened to you was very unpleasant, and can understand why that would be distressing, but it just simply is not against policy. And in those cases, particularly when there are several of those cases where the same policy perhaps that a citizen may think is or the same, I should say, conduct is that a citizen is complaining about is within policy, and we announce that you know, there often is some frustration when people come to our meetings and they say, you know, we just heard 5 cases in a row and you're clearing these guys for the same thing. And we have to say, well, that like these are the policies, but we also think that there's real value in having individuals know that these are the policies, and that if we really want some movement at the end of the day, we have to kind of push on these policies a bit. And we can do some of that work at CCA, but at the end of the day, you know, outside of making recommendations that are somewhat narrow in scope, a lot of that advocacy has to really take place from the citizens. And so it's a constant process of us having to really engage with them to get them to understand that and understand what our limitations are, as well as what the opportunities are to really leverage what we're doing to advance some of the goals that the citizens care about here in our community.
Let me ask another follow-up to that. To the extent that they come to you with something that, again, doesn't fall within the four corners of what your office does or what it's authorized to do, do you find that there are adequate alternatives that you can refer them to, or is there kind of a gap in terms of what people are looking for versus what's available to them?
Yeah, if they are looking to, at times they're complaining about individuals who simply are just outside of our jurisdiction, and so we can say, we don't handle, complaints against this particular type of officer, and so those are sort of the easy cases to refer and to get at least some resolution. We also have a set of allegations that we typically do not investigate that are sort of our secondary causes of actions, what we call them, things like discourtesy or lack of service. If someone says an officer, was rude to them or used profanity, if that's the only allegation they're making, we tend to refer that to the police department for an internal process that they have, and we don't investigate that case in isolation as a general matter. And so there are easy ways to refer those cases, but some of the other things are folks are really upset about practices and really upset at the department writ large. I mean, those are harder cases for us because we have to say to people at the end of the day, we can make some recommendations that go to some of the trends that we note through the course of our individual investigations, but we really can't investigate the department as opposed to what DOJ can do when they come and they investigate an entire department. That really is not what we do, although we can make some recommendations that are thematic. We're somewhat limited in our ability to just bring in 10 folks who are disconnected from a particular complaint and to question them about a particular practice. So those are harder conversations to have.
Got it. Thank you. Sergio, I have a question that touches upon some of your prior experience that I discussed during my introduction of you at the beginning of the webinar. Specifically, I'd like to explore kind of the work that you did at the Department of Justice. Gabe just now, for example, mentioned that some of what people come to him for might be better handled by, or might be more appropriately handled by federal authorities who actually are empowered to do the thing that is being sought to be done. And you, frankly, did a lot of that work, or were involved in a lot of that work. Can you talk about the work that you did as a federal civil rights attorney at the Department of Justice, and kind of how it differs from the work that local or county level accountability bodies do?
Certainly. The biggest difference between what the U.S. Department of Justice can do with regards to law enforcement agencies across the country and what local oversight agencies can do is it boils down to enforcement, which is the Civil Rights Division has the jurisdiction by act of Congress to investigate patterns or practices of unconstitutional conduct by law enforcement agencies across the United States, including its territories. And that means that it has the authority by federal law to request information related to allegations of unconstitutional conduct. And that's really special. And that came about in the mid-90s following the Rodney King incident in Los Angeles, the savage beating of Mr. King there by members of the LAPD. And it's been used by successive administrations to investigate allegations of widespread racial profiling by law enforcement agencies, widespread and consistent misuses of force, including deadly, but not limited to deadly force, and also practices within detention facilities of various kinds and sizes. When I was a trial attorney with the Civil Rights Division, the administration at the time, the Obama administration, was particularly active and strident in ensuring that law was enforced. It went into places like Maricopa County following allegations of racial profiling by Sheriff Joe Arpaio and the Sheriff's Department there. I was the lead attorney on investigating and litigating those allegations of racial profiling. And that, again, is what makes it special. You don't just sort of understand, investigate, and then report. You can then file suit in federal court. The U.S. Department of Justice is standing as a representative of the United States and its people to file a lawsuit against law enforcement agencies that it believes are engaged in unconstitutional conduct, and to seek consent decrees or other kinds of agreements to change those practices and ensure that those changes take place. And Gabe's experience and the experience in Oakland is in part an outgrowth of consent decrees or settlement agreements that have followed those investigations. It's an awesome tool when used, and it has been now copied in various ways by several states throughout the United States. And by that, I mean that increasingly states attorneys general now have the jurisdiction to conduct this work. The California Department of Justice is one of those. And so it's a particular strategy to addressing the systemic issues that members of the community often identify and complain about, but that before 1994, there was no real legal avenue outside of private lawsuits by stakeholder communities, groups like the ACLU, to empower a government actor like the federal government to come in and say another government actor is misusing its authority in violation of the Constitution is a real special thing and a really interesting practice that continues to develop.
Thank you. Now, Gabe, I know that you yourself also have experience at the Department of Justice in an area that overlaps with Sergio's, but is distinct from it as well. Can you talk a little bit about that work, including how it differs from the patterns and practices work that Sergio handled, and again, kind of the role that work fills in the accountability landscape?
Yeah, sure. For almost 4 years, I was a prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division, and like Sergio, we dealt with similar subject matter, but I dealt with it in the criminal section of that division. So we prosecuted individual officers and investigated individual officers who were accused of misconduct. So we did not investigate departments. We went after so-called bad apples. I hate to use that term, but that's what we we went after individuals who were accused of doing really bad things. And the law we enforced, it was 18 U.S.C. 242, which criminalizes willfully depriving someone of a constitutional right, and sort of is a shorthand. And so, unfortunately for us, many times it can be frustrating because it's a very high threshold to meet. There's a willfulness requirement under the law to show a certain level of criminal intent. You have to show essentially that someone intended to violate someone's constitutional rights. So again, I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but many times, just showing that a mistake was made or that someone did something that was unreasonable under the law is not enough. We have to show the extra step that they had a level of intent behind that. But there are some notable cases where the division did prosecute individuals and officers. I think the Rodney King meeting was mentioned earlier. Ultimately, those officers, although they were not convicted in state court, they were prosecuted federally by the Civil Rights Division. A handful of the officers were, I should say, and were convicted after those prosecutions. We also, not we anymore, but the division had recently charged Officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd as well. And so there are some notable examples. The first case I worked on there was a case where a small town in Alabama, the assistant police chief there was beating confessions out of a suspect there. And so we investigated that case, and I, along with another federal prosecutor from Alabama, prosecuted him for violating civil rights of the individual who he was beating. And so those are some examples of the kind of work that we did and that happens still that layers on top of what we all do currently as civilian practitioners.
Thank you. Regina, I wanted to revisit something that you had alluded to before. So, the Oakland Police Commission wields significant oversight authority over the Oakland Police Department. However, I feel that even with that kind of high level of authority, I presume that there are still things that remain out of the reach of the commission, either because they fall out of the commission's mandate or because there are just some things about policing that are incredibly hard to change. Can you talk about what some of those challenges are and how the commission or how others can kind of work to help overcome them?
Certainly. And yes, there are quite a few challenges. Some of the real stuff is that you don't always know what you don't know. And so trying to get a sense of what goes on behind scenes, whether it's inside OPD or in city leadership, what the history is, in order to allow you to step forward, almost like in a civil rights approach, right? Because, there are laws that we have to abide by, but we got to figure out, which ones should be broken. And I don't mean should be broken like just nefariously, but which ones need to be recalled and remade. We've got a meeting with some of our state legislators right now because, as I believe it was Gabe or Jorge mentioned, it's a lot of the state limitations that are putting a stranglehold on us. But you have to also have the right leader in place. We have some deep cultural challenges that are both around race and gender and just that blue line that is so deeply rooted. And we are pushing and supporting our chief to make those changes, and they are challenging, especially the root of them. And so it's not just about understanding implicit or explicit bias. It's about saying it won't be tolerated and it will be held to the highest account. And with that, we have brazen violence that is happening right now, and we have the lowest numbers of police on the street. We're down 70 due to retirement, due to policy changes and people not wanting to conform, due to issues around race and gender. And some of those things, policy isn't enough. It really is about trying to direct the practice and the shift of culture. And so, changing laws, challenging laws, figuring out which ones to challenge takes an extraordinary amount of time. And, like I said, as commissioners, we are working overtime and trying to figure out where you can get the best wins and what you can dig at that's going to move and shift over time because you're paying attention to it and you are trying to create coalitions of support around it. I think the use of force policy that we dug into has given us extraordinary assistance because people now know, okay, it's like there's a new sheriff in town, so to speak. And because the commission has been strong on discipline, like I said, terminating our police chief, making recommendations for terminations of other officers, people now know it's harder in Oakland, and it's harder already in Oakland because of the violence. So we're asking more from our officers, and we've got to provide them more support and trying to build community trust with the changing of the culture in resolving crime. It's like 100% in every way. And we're pushing at the worst time in life, which is a pandemic when people are suffering the most.
Thank you. Gia, I see you have a response as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, among the different resources that NACOL provides, we actually just got a grant to address all of the things that are up against oversight agencies. So we're going to actually be looking at, labor bargaining agreements, and we're going to be looking at legislation from municipal, state, and even federal sources that actually keep us from being able to do our jobs. And we'll be actually sharing that with everybody. So I want to make sure that people really look into what is available at nacol.org or reach out to us and ask if you need resources or need any kind of direction for your own research or questions that you have that you're sharing with community. We're happy to help with all of those good things. But we're really excited about this grant that will help us identify, bigger structural problems for how we're battling, trying to get our mandates done.
Thank you, Gia. We're reaching the final 10 minutes of our allotted time, so I want to take a step back. And Gia, I'll pose you this question. We've talked a lot about local and federal approaches to oversight, but we haven't really talked about state level approaches to oversight. What role have states assumed in this space, and what role should they assume?
So that is a huge question, and I think with everybody from different places, we probably could all come up with different answers to that question. here in Colorado, they actually passed a couple of police accountability bills last year, or this last session this year, that really are going to make a huge difference in the way that oversight is able to actually progress. So one of the things that was a huge impediment was not being able to actually track an officer's disciplinary history. At the state level, it's really difficult. If they resign before a case is completed, you don't finish the case. And so POST, which is the Police Officer Standards, you guys can help with this, standards and training, I think, is actually now mandated to keep track of what's happened with all officers that they actually certify as POST certified. There's a bunch of other things, such as the AG now has the ability to investigate officer involved shootings. You know, the Elijah McClain shooting, or the Elijah McClain murder last 2 years ago, 2019. I think it was 2019, early 2019, you know, was basically dead in the water. No discipline was happening. You know, there was no criminal charges. And the AG was actually able to go back in after, you know, some of the legislation that passed last year and reinvestigate that case, and actually is now being able to hold not only the officers, but also the EMTs that, you know, gave him ketamine accountable, right? And I think that that's happening in a lot more places than we know, but we will be, you know, there's ways to actually pull all of that information together, and we're just starting to get a feel for it after 2020. A lot of that legislation passed. So I invite everybody else to talk about what's going on in their state, but we're working on gathering a lot of that information, and we definitely hear about it. It's exciting. The state level stuff makes the local stuff a lot easier.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Gia. And I'll offer one final question to close us out in our remaining minutes. I'll present it first to Gia, but also invite our other panelists to offer their thoughts as well. As you reflect on kind of the state of oversight and accountability, what would you identify as kind of some of the more noteworthy successes that you've seen, and what have been some of the more troubling setbacks?
I'll start with the setbacks, because I think that there's a whole swing of action that's happening with police unions and with policy right now. As a result of the crime, you know, that I believe probably is a little bit pandemic involved, meaning that we've all been so isolated that it's really easy for us to actually look at crime and say crime is, you know, out of control at this point, right? I know that shootings, especially among young people, are crazy. In Denver and in Colorado, we had, you know, 7 kids shot in the last week, very close to their schools or on their school campuses. People are actually not looking at the underlying issues nearly so much as using, you know, the decrease in police budgets as a way to actually fight back the things that we actually won after George Floyd's death, which was not, and I don't want to discuss it in terms of funding, defunding, but we actually, most municipalities at least funded some kind of social services in addition to funding their police departments after George Floyd's death. A lot of people agreed that, you know, that there were certain cases that came in through 911 that shouldn't have gone to 911, and that there were better people to actually deal with those crises. And so what we actually have found is that in the last probably 6 to 8 months, the crime rate and the number of you know, gun crimes and violent crimes going up is actually pushing us the opposite direction, so that we're not actually talking about, you know, increasing the ability of oversight to do their job anymore. Now we're talking about holding on to what we have in a lot of places, and that's a little bit scary, right? It should have actually been one of those things where we saw what was going on and we're able to respond to it. So I'll let other people actually work on that, but I'm seeing a swing back the opposite direction in a lot of places. Oh, and you asked about the things that are most exciting. Because there was actually enough, I think enough recent research and enough outreach, I think that people are really looking at starting organizations, oversight organizations that actually have sufficient authority to start. And, you know, that means actually doing all of the groundwork and giving them, you know, a really reasonable budget, giving them enough positions to do their mandates, all of that good stuff. Where in the past, we've always seen oversight actually start as the result of a critical incident, be underfunded from the beginning, and then fight for the first 5 or 10 or 15 years to actually get what they need to actually do the work, right? So a lot of the new organizations that are coming online actually have done their research, they've been trained, they actually understand what their mandate is, and they have the resources to do the work. So that's exciting to me.
Thank you. Sergio, I saw that you might have a comment as well.
No, I appreciate that. And a lot of what Gia laid out reflects my own perspective on this question. I think that there have been some successes, especially at the state level, to further empower local efforts to hold law enforcement agencies and their members accountable. I think one of the interesting and difficult consequences of the murder of George Floyd and other high-profile tragic events that have brought into focus the need for more accountability in law enforcement space is a lack of acceptance and appreciation amongst law enforcement for accountability and community involvement. And this highlights in many ways the cultural issues that Regina was highlighting in Oakland, which is I do believe that we are seeing a step back on the acceptance of oversight and community involvement by law enforcement agencies across the country. And this was true when I was working for the US DOJ, and it's been true in each of the engagements that I've had throughout California, which is rarely do I see a truly held invitation for more community involvement. I was shocked, right, recently when I was reading an academic article that highlighted that in the 60s, activists and community stakeholders were emphasizing a need for community involvement in the creation of policies by law enforcement agencies, meaning they wanted a seat at the table when a use of force policy was up for review and modification. The fact that that was being spoken about and discussed in the 1960s, and here we are in 2021, where that isn't happening in most of our law enforcement agencies, I think is a real warning sign about how slowly this conversation has moved and how slowly that conversation has led to real change. I think law enforcement agencies improve when they create and provide real seats at the table for the members of the community that they serve. But what we're seeing now is this embattled, aggrieved perspective, which is, well, folks are leaving law enforcement agencies because they are being scrutinized too much, or they are hesitating to apply to be members of law enforcement agencies, when routinely the stats that do come out on this don't really speak to that. The jobs are well paid, and they are accessible in many ways to wide swaths of our community. And we shouldn't recoil from ensuring that the members of the community that they serve understand how they're being served and have an opportunity to influence those services.
Thank you. Regina, I see you may have a comment as well.
Absolutely. So I'm a youth development expert. And so it was always very interesting to me that when you ask kids what they wanted to be when they grew up, it would be police or fire or basketball or what have you. And over the last decade or so, nobody wants to be a police officer. And that speaks volumes for their engagement with officers or their lack of engagement. You know, we used to have people on patrol, on foot patrol, and now they just drive by. Sometimes they've got glasses, you know, there's no real connection. And so, you know, this change, you know, one of the challenges obviously has been the disconnection of officers to the communities that they police. Up until just a couple of years ago, I think it was only about 9% officers actually lived in the city of Oakland. And so one of the challenges now becomes one of the opportunities, in that the most recent academy, which just started like a week ago, is 39 people, and they all have a connection, either born in Oakland, live in Oakland, lived in Oakland, and then got gentrified, but wanting to come back to kind of save their city. And I think a lot of it has to do with the courageousness of our police chief, who is doing a yeoman's effort in trying to turn things around, but he can't do it alone. And so I'm loving that kind of an internal, it's an external outreach to find people with kind of loyal to the soil connection. The other thing is that we've been extraordinarily productive with our policies. Probation and parole requires no more warrantless searches. So you are not continuing to discipline and denigrate people who have been on the wrong side of justice, but once they have done their time, have not really been able to reintroduce into society. I mean, we've got to change that. And so this is a way to at least acknowledge that we're not going to continue to abuse and re-abuse based upon, discipline that's already been meted out and done. In addition to that, I mentioned our use of force, but I think our armed and unresponsive policy has also been critical, where 3 years ago, someone was killed in being armed and unresponsive. Now that we've put a new policy in place, we've had dozens of engagements with armed and unresponsive people, and none have ended up even in a shooting, let alone a death. Our missing persons policy that's going to come off the pipeline probably in January is also pretty transformational. And again, we wouldn't be where we are in terms of the transformation without victims' families being willing to give us the benefit of their wisdom, the benefit of perhaps mistakes that were made that they want to ensure don't get made again. And so, building the, community asset-based approach, giving them access and them wanting to help, even if they have been traumatized in their experience. This is a time that the passion and humanity and compassion and empathy is really on the line. It's absolutely critical for turning around where we need to be, because Oakland, not unlike other cities, is on fire. And, while our system has been broken, we all need a police officer when we're in crisis. And some of these brazen crimes out here, we are happy that our folks are well trained and well skilled. And we haven't had an officer involved shooting in, over a year. And that's also critical too. So OPD is making some extraordinary strides. Some of it is leadership. Some of it is the police oversight. Some of it is community outcry. And we just have to keep, fighting that battle and getting more people, particularly at the state levels, to help us navigate the barriers that are in our way.
Thank you so much, Regina. I think with that, you've given us both our call to action as well as hope for the future despite the obstacles that have been presented. So thank you for that. I can think of no better note to end on than that. I will offer a final plug for NACOL.org. There were folks in the Q&A section who were asking about some of the specifics about some of the models, their structure, their funding, some of the more specifics about that. NACOL has tremendous resources on civilian oversight models generally that people should consult if they want to educate themselves more about what's out there. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. Thank you so much to all of the audience members who joined us today. And I hope that you'll join us next year for future policing conversations. Thank you.